So my name is Jeff Miller. I work for Cooperative Extension in Oneida County. With the current price of soybeans, in fact, commodities in general, I thought that growers who have not grown soybeans before might be planting soybeans this spring. So I thought that I should cover the basic best management practices related to producing soybeans. So that's what I plan to do in the next 45 minutes. If you have any questions, move your cursor to the bottom of the page. You'll see chat. Click on chat, and then at the bottom of that box, you'll see everyone, and it says like type here. Click where it says type here. You can type in your questions, comments, any problems you may be having. All right, so we'll get started. So the first question is, why do we even consider growing soybeans? In the early days, when Roundup Ready soybeans first came out, people were growing soybeans to control some of the most troublesome weeds like quackgrass and wire stem muley, especially wire stem muley, because it had the habit of popping up a little bit later in the season after people had already applied their herbicides, and it's a perennial, so it created some pretty big headaches and yield losses. Another reason to grow soybeans is to break up long corn rotations, insect pest cycles, to improve tilth, and to increase corn yield. You can pop corn yields by 5% by breaking up that cycle and growing soybeans in between. It can be a profitable crop if grown correctly, and definitely at current prices. The only reason why people should grow soybeans is that it fits their soils, fits their rotation, they have the equipment, and it fits their objectives. Okay, what's a good site for soybeans to be planted? Not in every field. You definitely know those fields that are wet throughout the season in the majority of our seasons. And then some folks have some well-drained, but actually excessively well-drained soils where it may not fit either. So what happens if you plant soybeans into wet fields that are wet not just in the spring, but throughout the season? The first thing is you plant the seed into the ground and you're opening yourself up to a lot more seedling rots. If you have ponded water on the surface, you open yourself up to phytophthora root rot. And if the root zone is wet throughout the season, you're probably going to have poor nodulation. That means less nitrogen fixation. That means less plant growth and less pods and less beans. There are those few cases where we have either gravel loams or sandy loams in the county or in the region, which allow water to pass through fairly quickly. And if we have a dry season and extended dry periods, that can reduce nodulation, nitrogen fixation, and crop yields. And if we have especially dry conditions during the flowering period, so from that first flower onset through pod fill, that also can reduce soybean yields. So this is a picture of a map of Oneida County. It indicates where we have silt loams, and soil texture is definitely one of the features that impacts drainage. So silt loams can be well drained to moderately well drained. If you look at the upper right-hand corners where it's white, that indicates that we have more sandier soils, and that's where you get into those cases, not in every year, but in some of those seasons where we have significant drought, where that can impact crop yields. In addition to texture, you have position of site. So if you happen to have a field that's at the foot of a slope and all the water comes off of the slope into that field, you know that that field is going to be wet and may not be appropriate for planting soybeans. What other site conditions should be considered before planting soybeans? pH, crop rotation, blight mold history, and the herbicide history from the previous crop. So you probably have all seen this chart before. This shows the impact of soil pH on nutrient availability. So you see in the chart 12 essential nutrients for plant production and growth. And we'll take one as an example, phosphorus. So that's in orange towards the top of your screen. Where that band is wide, that indicates a greater availability of that particular nutrient. Where that band narrows, so at a pH of, let's say, below 6.5, you start to see phosphorus going down in availability. And at the same time, above 7.5, you see a reduction in availability of that phosphorus. So pH is the foundation for the nutrient availability for your crops. Some recent research out of Michigan State University, where they looked at soybean production, they determined that the best pH, not only for nutrient availability, but biological nitrogen fixation, was between the range of 6.3 and 6.5. Now we talk about crop rotation. The first thing is to try to avoid soybeans after soybeans. Can you do that? Yes, you can. What are some of the risks involved? Well, one of the significant pests of soybeans is soybean aphids. Soybean aphids, at the end of the season, they may be building in population and really not be a problem in the current year, but then they become a winged generation and they fly off to nearby buckthorn plants, as an example. And we have plenty of buckthorn on the outskirts of our fields, and they overwinter there. And guess what? If you grow soybeans in that field next year, you kind of have a ready supply of that particular pest problem. And yes, it can reduce yield significantly. Jamie Cummings, who's our second speaker of the day, is going to talk to you a lot more about disease management. And that's another thing to be considered when you're talking about soybeans after soybeans. The next thing, you should consider having a 3-year or more rotation between soybeans and crops that are highly susceptible to white mold. So some folks in our area grow snap beans, and they're definitely susceptible to white mold. Some people have experimented with sunflowers, and they're susceptible to white molds. And if you have a soybean crop and you're loaded with white mold this year, you should definitely consider trying to have 3 years in between the next time that field sees soybeans. One of the common rotations in the area is corn soy. So corn soy, corn soy, corn soy. Well, that's a 1-year break, and that's working for people. You know, we're going to say that, yeah, we have spotty issues with white mold, but not really that much, and people are being very successful with that corn soy rotation. Another popular rotation is corn soy wheat. So that buys you 2 years in between planting a field back to soybeans. So that increases or actually reduces the possibility of seeing white mold in those fields. So that's a really good thing. And I'm definitely a proponent of cover crops, and definitely the grain producers in the area are trying to get cover crops into their rotations. And this is not an easy thing, but if you could follow your corn crop with winter rye, that would give you some coverage in the off season. And if you follow soy with wheat, that's providing a cover over winter. And if you're a wheat grower that frost crack seeds red clover, then the red clover can be a cover after the wheat crop is harvested. And that provides you continuous cover, which is a great thing, reducing soil erosion and all those other benefits of cover crops. So another thing to consider, we already talked about the popularity of following corn with soybeans. Well, you should look at the herbicides that you're using in that corn crop and determining if they could, and that is the residual from these products, if they could be a problem for soybeans in that next season. So looking at the bottom of this chart, you have Permit and Resolve Q, both used post-emergence, and they're group 2 sulfonylureas. And you can see to the right of them restrictions, and you have 9 to 10 month restrictions. So you got to really watch when they're applied and when you're going to be planting soybeans following that. In addition, you see the group 27. So those are the Hppd inhibitors. And you have things like Callisto and Callisto containing products like Halix and Acuron, Caprino. So each one of those have a 10-month restriction. So again, you got to just circle on the calendar when it's applied, and then make sure that your soybeans are 10 months after that period. The last thing is atrazine. People are pretty familiar with atrazine. That's group 5, the triazines, and that's a rate and timing thing that you got to think about with atrazine. And following that corn crop that you've used atrazine in with soybeans. So what kind of seed bed do we need to plant soybeans? You know, everybody's going to have a different opinion on this, but the major thing that everybody's going to be on board with is to make sure that rocks are picked to allow for combining at a 3-inch height. So why do we have to think about that 3-inch height? Again, there's been studies out there, and if you have drilled rows, so 7.5-inch rows, the pod height of those first pods is going to be higher, like in that 4-inch range. If you're planting 30-inch row spacing, there's not as much pressure for the plants to grow upward really quickly and to set pods higher. In fact, they're going to set pods lower. So unless you want to lose yields, you want to be able to harvest to combine at a 3-inch height. The other condition that you want at the time of planting soybeans is a friable soil. That just means crumbly. And this is the kicker: add a moisture that will not cause sidewall compaction, but will allow planter disc entry and placement at the depth that you want to place at, and good seam closure after you've planted the seed, yielding good soil seed contact. Well, that's a lot to ask, and one of the earlier adopters of no-till in the area, Paul O'Mara, definitely gave us some guidance on that one year when it got dry, and basically said, hey, you know, you get to a certain point, you can't get penetration, the seed's not going where it needs to go, you have to get the tillage equipment out and scratch up that surface to get that coverage. Soybeans definitely can be no-tilled successfully and is being no-tilled successfully in corn stubble in our area. Again, adequate moisture is a big part of that. So making sure that those planter discs get to the depth that you need to get to, having row cleaners, and a well-maintained planter. So talking about planting with a grain drill versus a corn planter, and we'll start to the left. You'll see at the bottom a sunflower drill. So this is an earlier model, pretty heavy. The person that owns this put a lot of extra weight in there to get good penetration. So the ability of that grain drill is, number one, to be able to plant narrower rows than what a corn planter can do. And so, yeah, 7.5 settings, 7.5-inch, 15-inch settings, very easy to do and accomplish with this tool. One of the benefits of that narrow row spacing is that you get canopy closure quicker, and that shading actually does work to help control weeds. And we saw from the 2020 season where plants were growing very slowly because of the cool temperatures and the dry conditions that we had, that there are a number of fields that never really got canopy closure. And because we didn't, what did you see? You saw a bunch of inter-row spaces that had a bunch of weeds because the products that we use only last so long. And if you still provide light and water, then those weed seeds can germinate in between. And we definitely had some weedier fields this past season. One of the things that's a downside for the drill is inferior depth control. So unfortunately, that seed is just not placed at a consistent depth. And you have inferior singulation of seed and seed spacing. And then finally, inferior seed coverage. So all those things are kind of working against the best germination possible. And most drills do not have a fertilizer hopper or disc openers for placing fertilizer, so there's no possibility of doing band fertilization with a drill. So moving over to the corn planter on the right, it just happens to be a John Deere. There's the 30-inch row spacing is pretty standard, and having that space slows down canopy closure. So there's a downside to that as far as its ability to trap all of the light that it then converts into those pods and beans. So that's, working against you as far as total yield. But it also doesn't create that humid environment below those leaves, below that closed canopy, which actually pushes white mold growth and development. So it's a plus on that end. There's definitely superior depth control, seed coverage, soil seed contact. And the thing that I see is that it really produces a more synchronized emergence of those germinating seedlings. And you may not think that that's that important, but if they come up at different times, they actually compete with each other. So that can definitely work against you as far as yield. And then one of the other key things that the corn plant allows you to do is to apply that band of fertilizer 2x2, 2 inches below and 2 inches to the side of that seed. So readily available for that seed to take up rather than having to broadcast it in the field prior to planting. And that's especially important for phosphorus fertilizer, because phosphorus, if you broadcast it, it gets tied up very quickly into chemical combinations that are just not available for plant uptake. So you're losing a bunch of fertilizer. You actually have to increase your rate of phosphorus if you're going to broadcast it. And there's plenty of people that document how important that is, that placement and timing of that fertilization. And growers here locally definitely report yields that are as good or better than fields that are drilled. So when should we plant soybeans in central New York? Frost is still, a concern for growers, and it should be. But I think we've learned that soybeans are more tolerant than we thought they would be of cold temperatures. You should see a map now of New York State and the average dates of last spring and in this case, last spring frosts. And you'll see, if you're looking at Oneida County, which is in the center of the map, that the majority of the area can be planted pretty safely May 20th, between May 10th and May 20th in most years. One of the things that's also important when you're thinking about planting soybeans is soil temperatures. And again, we'll go back to 2020, unique season. I think record cold temperatures in some areas of New York State this past spring. And I was measuring soil temperatures, and they were still in the 40s at 9 a.m. in the morning, down to a depth of 2 inches, right up to the third week of May this year. So, that is something that's going to say, yeah, those soybeans are not going to do much at that soil temperature. Now, I realize, some people have just large acreage and they just have to go when they have the weather to go. And yeah, it's definitely dry enough to plant early. But this is something to be considered. I will say, again, local growers are obtaining better yields when they're planting in mid-May versus planting in late May. So that makes a big difference, especially with early maturity varieties. So what maturity group should you be planting in central New York? Cooperative Extension used to recommend to plant between 1.5s and 2.1s in central New York, even in the recent past. But growers have been trying out earlier maturity groups for a while now. And definitely the harvest season of 2018 and 2019 being a nightmare has pushed growers to consider early maturity varieties to try to avoid the wet period in the fall. And they're gaining experience and seeing that when they plant early maturity varieties early, they're not really suffering much in the way of yield loss. So this is just one study. You can go online and find lots of different studies. This happens to be a university trial out of central Michigan, and it shows Roundup Ready varieties maturity groups anywhere from 0.9 to I think it's 2.3 is the longest. And you start looking at that column over to the right, 2009 average yield in bushels per acre, and you're going to see that there's definitely some of those early maturity varieties that are competing with those longer maturity varieties. I'm not going to say they all do. I think you really have to do your homework to pick out the ones that are doing the best to vie with those longer season beans, but there's definitely some out there. That moves us to variety selection. And you've been through this many, many, many times. You've read the results from university trials in your area. You go to field days to see, how they're performing right in your area. Look for trial results, not just from 1 year or one location, but a few locations over a few years, if that's possible. So you can see that it's performing in different environments and in different climate situations. Try some new varieties every year, a small test plot on your own farm to evaluate them. Most seed companies, I'd almost say all seed companies, have some good varieties out there in multiple maturity groups. So definitely talk to your seedsman. So do you need to inoculate seed for optimal yields of soybeans? And Bill Cox, retired emeritus professor at Cornell, did years of work looking at these kinds of issues, and definitely proved both in fields that had a soybean history and soybeans that did not have a soybean history that your yields were better when you used inoculant. So most growers are buying pre-inoculated seed and adding fresh inoculum to the seed at planting. Inoculum is live bacteria, and if not handled correctly, can lose viability. So soybean seed should be double inoculated, especially when planting fields with no history of soybeans. And definitely, we've seen that time and time again in this county, where even with double inoculation in some years, we just don't get good nodulation. So I'll say that those kind of crops can be rescued. 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre at that first flower can definitely save those kind of crops. But a good way to test out the nodulation is to get the shovel out of the back of the truck, dig up a couple plants. You'll see in the picture above, don't mind me trying to get a pointer, but in the picture above, pretty good nodulation here, right? Those white nodules on the roots. And then if you cut them open, they should be pink or red inside. That means that they're actively fixing nitrogen. So this is an important thing to look at, and especially in dry springs, to get that shovel out, at least by first flower, to see how good the nodulation is. How far apart should you set your rows? Again, Bill Cox did years and years of research. This is old, I apologize for that, but it just shows one of the many studies that he did, and in the latest studies that he did still find a 2 bushel, maybe sometimes a little more yield benefit from going from 30-inch rows to 15-inch rows. An additional 1, maybe a little over 1 bushel per acre going from 15-inch rows to 7-inch rows. So what are most local growers doing? They're planting with a corn planter, and they're planting soybeans into 30-inch rows. And they're doing that because of that better depth control and signalation and that synchronization of those germinating seedlings. That's why they're doing it. They're also looking at that white mold issue when planting. And when you see more drills in the field, it's because it's a wet spring and we have really tight windows to get lots of acres planted, and people are just saying, okay, so we're breaking out all the equipment and we're just going to go when the weather's right. Drill is going to be putting in beans, and corn planters are going to be planting corn. But another reason why people choose 30-inch row spacings for soybeans is management. So going in there after planting and applying an herbicide between 3 and 4 weeks after planting. Scouting is easier, when you have that row spacing. And if you have to do an insecticide application, again, just easier to manage. Now we'll talk about seeding rates. And again, Bill Cox did a whole bunch of studies on seeding rates. If you went to the current guidelines from Cornell, based on these research trials, with untreated seed, the recommendation would be for 7.5-inch rows, a seed drop of 170,000 seeds per acre. For 15-inch rows, 160,000 seeds per acre. For 30-inch rows, 150,000 seeds per acre. If you treat the seed, you can reduce that seed drop by between 10,000 and 20,000 seeds per acre. And definitely growers have been doing that, and doing that successfully and not paying a yield penalty. So how deep should we be planting? This is a really important thing, and I know I've learned this right alongside of some local growers. Definitely a lot of people were planting at 1-inch depth, and I'm just saying don't do it because there's that off year where we have a dry spring and that top inch is dry. And then you get these rains, so you get this intermittent germination, and you get this uneven stand, and some years it's definitely wiped out fields. So I'm saying don't plant at 1 inch, plant at 1.5 inches, even to 1 3/4 inches in tilled fields. And if you're no-tilling, you should be planting at 2 inches, just to make sure that you got the depth that you need and the coverage that you need. Now, soil texture plays a role. If you have sandy soils, you can plant deeper. If you have surface compaction and you know it, then you should be planting on the more shallow side. So now we're taking a quick and brief look at fertilization. So the first and ultimate thing is managing that pH again. So that's availability of all those nutrients. So if your pH needs to be raised, lime should be applied a minimum of 8 months before you plant soybeans. So that doesn't mean, okay, you make a decision on the fly that you're going to plant soybeans this coming spring, and you check your pH and it's 5.5, and you're just going to go in the spring and apply some lime and that's going to make everything right. It isn't. That pH doesn't change that quickly. If you're going to buy some lime to improve the pH in certain situations, you should be looking at your soil test results. If you're showing medium to low levels of magnesium, you should definitely be considering choosing a high mag lime. And so you're going to be changing the pH as well as adding magnesium to the soil. So this is clipped right out of the Cornell guide, and it's fertilizer recommendations for soybeans. And you can see both NP and K recommendations. Now I'm just going to guide you to a medium soil test. So if you have a medium soil test from Cornell, then the recommendation is going to be to apply 20 pounds of potassium per acre. So is that 20 pounds of some potash containing fertilizer? No, that's 20 pounds of potassium. So if you have an 0060, which is 60% potassium, then you're going to have to apply 33 pounds of that material to get 20 pounds of potassium. 20 divided by 60, 1/3, okay? Same thing with phosphorus. That's if you have a medium level of phosphorus, the recommendation from Cornell would be 20 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And if you're using 11-52-0 MAP, monoammonium phosphate, that's 52 pounds of phosphorus per 100 pounds of fertilizer applied. So you can see that you can get away with less than half, right? So in that 40-pound range of that fertilizer is going to give you roughly 20 pounds of phosphorus per acre. Definitely we have discussions about this whole thing. Do we need to apply nitrogen? Don't we need to apply nitrogen? A little bit of nitrogen is not going to hurt, especially if you're one of these growers that's moving to that mid-May planting, earlier plantings. Well, where are those plants getting that nitrogen from? Generally, it's organic sources that have to be converted from the form that they're in, organic form, into a form that can be taken up by the plants, which takes biological action. So we already talked about soil temperatures. If soil temperatures are low, biological activity is low. So a little bit of a readily available source of nitrogen is not a bad thing. So that's quick and dirty. So when planting with a drill that doesn't have a fertilizer hopper or disc openers to place that fertilizer, you're going to have to broadcast it prior to planting, and usually that means incorporating as well. So if you're putting phosphorus on, and the Cornell recommendation from our Cornell soil test says 20 pounds of phosphorus, you got to increase that by 50%. So you got to apply 30 pounds of P per acre, because again, you're throwing it out there. It's going to have a lot of soil contact. The chemical reactions are going to occur quickly, and there's going to be a bunch of it that's just not going to be available for plant uptake. Growers who plant mid-May or earlier should consider putting a little nitrogen down at planting. N, P, and K can be applied 2 by 2 in the band with a corn planter. And one of the things to look out for is not to exceed 80 pounds of nitrogen and potassium in that 2 by 2 band. I don't see why people would really hit that number. So now we're going to move to early season corn pests. And you know, those of you who attended the first part of the Crop Congress, Ken Wise did a great job talking about seed corn maggots and wireworms. And I'm just going to say, seed corn maggot, the thing that you're looking for, if you look at that picture to the bottom right, you're looking for the skips in the rows, and then you're digging the seed out in those skips to see, okay, what's causing this skip? You know, did the seed not get put down? Did we have birds who ate the seed? Or if you dig out the seed and you see a hole in it, now you can start suspecting that it's seed corn maggot or wireworm. Hopefully you use the seed treater, and hopefully you don't see an awful lot of skips in the field. But dairy farmers are probably more likely to see this issue than grain producers, because if you look at local fields, fields that have been manured are just more attractive to the fly that is looking to lay its eggs, to have them hatch in that organic matter. And then they move to that large seeded crop like corn or soybeans to feed on that seed. Grain growers, probably less of an issue. Wireworm, definitely see a lot more of that if you're going from either pasture or hay lot into soybeans. And this is one of my fears this year, is that landowners that are looking at this price and saying, hey, I got a gold mine here, I'm going to plow out the back 40 pasture. This is the pest that I'd be watching out for. And again, can be handled with seed treatment. Black cutworm, I don't really see an awful lot of cutworm injury in local soybean fields. In the occasional corn fields, but not really so much in soybean fields. Slugs, definitely we have a lot more fields that are conservation tilled, so that might be strip tilled and still a lot of aftermath from that previous crop, or no tilled, same thing. And so this provides a lot of harborage for these slugs and snails. And we definitely see more and more feeding damage, and you'll see off to the right there that window painting that indicates that slugs or snails have been feeding. As far as treatment goes, yeah, there are some baits out there. Sluggo metallohyde is the active ingredient. It's effective, but it's a bait, and the distribution is pretty hard to come across or to do well. And the cost is kind of prohibitive. You know, if you're a sweet corn grower, maybe, but for field corn, it's a stiff price. And then finally, soybean aphids. We don't really think of them as seedling issues per se, but back to that example, we have the numbers that were not really quite threshold in a field. The last generation of those aphids are wings. They fly off to that buckthorn that's right on the edge of your field. And maybe you plant soybeans in the field just adjacent to that. Well, here they are. And if you have nothing treated on the seed, those numbers can build up over the early spring and get into a threshold where you may have to treat them over the top in the middle of summer. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is insecticides used in seed treatments. And so you have these two main groups, the neonics, group 4A, and the anthrillic diamides, group 28. So the neonics, I think you're really familiar with them. You've heard the names before: Poncho, Cruiser, Gaucho. They're neuroactive compounds similar to the mode of action of organophosphates and carbamates, but cause less toxicity to mammals and birds. And just, let's face it, really small quantities on a per seed basis, and that doesn't add up to very much on a per acre basis. The diamides, maybe not as familiar with them. Lumivia and Fortenza are two, common named products that are the diamides, group 28. Mode of action is they deplete calcium in the muscles, resulting in paralysis. So I'm going to move very quickly to what they actually control, of the major pests that we're concerned about. And when you look at the major pests that we are concerned about, you have wireworms and seed-corn maggot, definitely on the list, and even some of the Lepidoptera, the cutworms. But definitely you don't see soybean aphids on this list. Whereas the neonics definitely help to control soybean aphids for that limited amount of time, that 45 days. But again, that can actually slow down the population to the point where you never get above a threshold in the season. You don't have to do over-the-top treatments. So seedling diseases, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Pythium, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, those are, the common ones, and then Phytophthora root rot. And if you look at the top of this page, you see Pythium, Phytophthora root rot, Rhizoctonia, and Fusarium. The red arrows indicate that product is really good on those particular diseases. Well, okay, so you don't see any particular one active ingredient that controls those four important problems. So that means that you have to combine two and maybe even more to come up with the coverage that you need to for common problems. And there are manufacturers and products that have the insecticide combined with two very effective fungicides that give you that full control for the things that we see as a common issue. So I'm going to move to weed control very quickly and say that glyphosate is still a very reasonable choice and does a very good job in many of our local soybean fields, and still should be considered as a primary control. But having said that, I'm going to say you should be maximizing the impact of that glyphosate by doing all the things necessary to make sure it works the way it should. So try to use a water source that isn't hard if possible. That may not be possible in the area. Use the recommended amount of ammonium sulfate. You've been hammered with that over and over. Read the label and choose the right rate based on the product that you're using. So if you use one knockoff versus another, you know that the amount of active ingredient changes from one bottle to the next, and you have to read the label to make sure you're putting on the right rate. You should also be considering the types of weeds that you're controlling based on what rate is necessary for those weeds, and the right rate for the size. If unfortunately you've been held out of the field, as those weeds get bigger, then the recommended rate of active ingredient also increases. I definitely see a lot of farmers who are trying to do with one set of nozzles, and so they're applying kind of between 10 and 20 gallons per acre on everything for pre-emergence and post-emergence. I'm just going to say, boy, if you make that investment in those nozzles and just keep them, clean them, and put them on when you need them, the label says put it on a 10-gallon rate. If you put it on a 10-gallon rate, you're basically going to get more active ingredient on that leaf surface rather than rolling off and hitting the soil where it has no action whatsoever. We use a calendar timing of 3 to 4 weeks after planting as a guide for when to apply Roundup to soybean fields. In 2020, we would have been way off. Why? Because it was so much cooler. We had dry conditions, so that really slowed down weed development. It's better to look at sizes. Grasses 1 to 2 inch height, broadleaf weeds 2 to 3 inch height. And don't apply Roundup when weeds are stressed. And yeah, we hit that right on this year. Unfortunately, it was too dry in many fields right around that 4 to 5 week period after planting. So if you have problems with grasses and you want to add something to the tank to maybe just give it more activity, things like a Shore, Fusilade, Post Select can be tank mixed with Roundup in a post-emergence treatment. And even acetochlor warrant is on a label for partnering with glyphosate for grass weed activity. For those of you that are doing conventional soybeans, this is a chart that's right in the Cornell guide. And I'll say here you are pre-plant, pre-emergence. I'm just going to look at horseweed because that is something showing up right now as far as Roundup resistant horseweed. And so there are some products that are rated pretty good for pre-emergence application. First rate, Metribuzin, Valor SX. We definitely saw that in the trials that we did in northern Oneida County this past year, actually 2 years ago now. But you can see based on the ratings in this chart, which products are best for broadleaf weed control. And first rate looks like a good one right across the board based on the research that was done. Then you look at post-emergence and look at the horse weed column again. Wow, like nothing. So if you think you're going to have mare's tail problems, make sure that you get a pre-emergence on if you have conventional beans. If you move to grass weed control, those standard things that we always think about, dual, warrant, outlook, all are going to provide excellent control for our most common annual grasses. Post-emergence, you have that whole list of group ones, Shore, Fusilade, Post Plus, Select Max, all good choices. So mare's tail, we definitely seeing more fields. I'm not saying a lot of fields, but more fields with glyphosate resistant mare's tail. So that's a concern. This particular pest, coming up on my closing time here, this particular pest acts as a winter annual 70% of the time. So hitting them in the field in the fall after you've harvested is definitely one timing to really get control of them. They produce 200,000 seeds per plant. They can germinate and grow immediately. So that's one of the problems, is they can grow from that seed anytime during the season. So if you can hammer the plants in the fall, it's an extra trip, it's an extra cost, but that's a good timing. You might have a time if you're doing no-till to do a burn down in the spring. So that's another timing. 2,4-D is definitely rated pretty well for control. And then you move into the newer products, the tolerant, the dicamba tolerant and 2,4-D tolerant soybeans. That you can use those two products in season in those tolerant beans to control some of these broadleaf weeds that have resistance. So XtendiMax is one of the new low volatility products. Can be used in Xtend beans. Roundup Xtend is going to have both dicamba and Roundup. You have to go through the training during the winter to be able to use these products, and you should be applying this when the weed height is 4 inches or thereabouts. Ingenia is just another form of that low volatility dicamba. Enlist soybeans, tolerant of 2,4-D, a special 2,4-D choline that has low volatility. And Enlist beans, Enlist Duo combines glyphosate and 2,4-D, weed heights of 3 to 6 inches. And unfortunately, I'm just going to have to end here to give the right amount of time for our next speaker. With that, I'm going to stop sharing